I'm Ethan Reynolds, 24, from a forgettable town in Minnesota where dreams often go to die. Despite my family's financial struggles, I maintained a 4.0 GPA throughout college, fueled by one burning ambition: studying international relations at Oxford University. When a once-in-a-lifetime scholarship opportunity finally appeared, my sister Kimberly decided my success threatened her comfort zone. She stole my passport days before my interview, with my parents' silent approval. What they didn't know was that I'd learned from experience. I always have a backup plan. Before I tell you how my sister tried to destroy my future, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had family try to sabotage your dreams. Growing up in Pinewood, Minnesota meant limited opportunities for someone with big dreams. My parents, Richard and Patricia Reynolds, weren't poor exactly, but with 4 kids and only my dad's factory supervisor salary, there wasn't money for college funds. Not that it would have mattered much for me. I was always the odd one out in our family dynamics. While my siblings were content with small-town life, I spent hours in our local library, reading about places I'd never been. My high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Finley, once told me, "Ethan, you've got the mind of a scholar trapped in a factory worker's circumstances." It wasn't meant as an insult, just a recognition of the uphill battle I faced. After graduation, while my friends immediately found jobs at the factory or local businesses, I worked 3 jobs simultaneously: morning shifts at the diner, afternoon hours at the hardware store, and weekend nights at the gas station. Every penny went into my community college fund. I lived at home, used the ancient laptop my cousin Trevor had given me, and avoided any unnecessary expenses. Community college wasn't glamorous, but Professor Leonard Jenkins in political science recognized something in me. "Reynolds," he'd say, "your analytical thinking is wasted in this town." With his recommendation letter, I transferred to State University on a partial scholarship after 2 years. The transition wasn't easy. I was older than most juniors, still working part-time jobs, and completely focused on academics while others enjoyed the typical college experience. But it was at State that I met Professor Samuel Wilson, who would change everything. Professor Wilson had silver hair and the kind of British accent that commanded respect in academic circles. He'd spent decades working with the United Nations before transitioning to academia. During his international diplomacy seminar, he asked a question about Middle Eastern politics that I answered with what I thought was a standard response. After class, he asked me to visit during office hours. "That perspective you shared," he said when I arrived, "it showed remarkable insight for someone who hasn't traveled extensively." Over the following weeks, Professor Wilson became my mentor. He loaned me books from his personal collection, invited me to diplomatic functions when foreign dignitaries visited campus, and pushed me harder than any professor before him. One evening in late February, I was helping him organize research materials when he mentioned the Oxford Global Leaders Scholarship. "It's extraordinarily competitive," he explained. "Only 5 American students receive it annually. Full tuition, living stipend, guaranteed internships with international organizations." I nodded politely, assuming he was sharing an interesting fact rather than a suggestion. "The application deadline is next week," he continued, watching me carefully. "I've taken the liberty of nominating you." The application process was grueling. Personal statements, research proposals, letters of recommendation, academic transcripts. I spent sleepless nights perfecting every detail while maintaining my coursework and part-time job at the university library. Then came the waiting. Weeks of anxiously checking my email between classes and work shifts. When I wasn't selected for the first round of interviews, the disappointment crushed me. Professor Wilson assured me that simply being nominated was an achievement, but I couldn't help feeling I'd let him down. 3 weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday morning, I was shelving books in the reference section when my phone vibrated with an email notification. "Dear Mr. Reynolds, we are pleased to inform you that following a review of application materials, you have been selected for a final interview for the Oxford Global Leaders Scholarship." The rest of the email explained that due to an unexpected withdrawal, I was being considered as an alternate candidate. The interview would be held in New York City in exactly 10 days with 3 Oxford professors and 2 UN diplomats serving as the selection committee. I immediately called my best friend Marcus Taylor, nearly incoherent with excitement. "Slow down, man," Marcus laughed. "Start from the beginning." After explaining, Marcus, who had moved to New York after graduation, immediately offered his apartment. "It's tiny, but there's a pull-out couch with your name on it. This is your shot, Ethan." That night, I spent nearly all my savings on non-refundable bus tickets to New York. The journey would take almost 20 hours each way, but flying was completely out of my budget. I carefully calculated that I could afford the travel, 2 days of basic meals, and a suitable tie to complement my only suit, a slightly too large navy ensemble I'd bought second-hand for graduation. As I confirmed the ticket purchase, a wave of both terror and exhilaration washed over me. This interview represented everything I'd worked for, my one chance to break free from the gravitational pull of small-town limitations. That evening at family dinner, I decided to share my news. My younger brother Kevin was absorbed in his phone, my parents looked exhausted from their workdays, and Kimberly, my older sister by 2 years, was complaining about her coworkers at the insurance office. "I have some news," I said during a rare moment of silence. "I've been selected for a final interview for a full scholarship to Oxford University. In England," I added, in case they weren't familiar with it. The silence that followed wasn't the excited pause I'd foolishly anticipated. It was the heavy quiet of incomprehension, as if I'd announced plans to become an astronaut or a movie star. "That's nice," my mother finally said, reaching for the mashed potatoes. "When is it?" "I leave next Thursday. The interview is Friday morning in New York." My father frowned. "New York? That's expensive. Who's paying for this trip?" "I am," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've saved enough." Kimberly set down her fork with a pointed clink. "Oxford? Isn't that where all those snobby rich kids go? Sounds like you're getting above yourself, little brother." As the conversation shifted back to Kevin's upcoming baseball tournament, I felt the familiar ache of being the family outsider. But this time, it didn't matter. In 10 days, I'd be sitting before people who valued academic excellence, people who might give me the key to a future beyond anything my family could imagine. What I didn't realize was how threatening that possibility would be to the family dynamic I'd always taken for granted. The days following my announcement passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension at home. I'd taken time off from my campus job to focus on interview preparation, spending hours in the library researching potential questions and refining my responses. Each evening, I'd return home to an increasingly chilly atmosphere. My parents never asked about my preparations. Kevin remained oblivious, as 16-year-olds often are to anything outside their immediate concerns. But Kimberly's behavior shifted from passive-aggressive comments to outright hostility. "So you think you're too good for us now?" she asked one evening, finding me practicing interview questions in front of the bathroom mirror. "This isn't about being too good for anyone," I replied, straightening my tie. "It's about pursuing an opportunity I've worked hard for." Kimberly leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. At 26, she'd never left Pinewood. After high school, she'd gotten a job at Midwest Regional Insurance, where she'd gradually worked her way up to senior claims processor, an achievement my parents celebrated with dinner at Applebee's and frequent mentions to neighbors and relatives. "You've always been like this," she said, her voice tight. "Always thinking you're special, different from the rest of us." The conversation was a familiar one, a dynamic established in childhood. When I won the district spelling bee in 4th grade, Kimberly had, accidentally, spilled orange juice on my certificate. When I was accepted to State University, she'd spent the entire celebration dinner talking about her recent promotion. My parents had always mediated these conflicts with the same approach, minimizing my achievements while elevating Kimberly's. "Not everyone needs fancy education to be successful," my father would say, while my mother would add, "Kimberly is doing so well with her practical career choices." 3 days before my departure, I received a call from Amanda Walsh, my girlfriend of 8 months. We met in international economics class, and while our relationship was still relatively new, her unwavering support had become a crucial part of my life. "How's the preparation going?" she asked, her voice a welcome respite from the household tension. "Good, I think. Professor Wilson set up a mock interview with 2 other professors yesterday." "And how did it go?" "They were impressed," I admitted, allowing myself a moment of pride. "Professor Wilson thinks I have a real shot at this." "Of course you do," Amanda said with characteristic certainty. "This scholarship was made for someone like you, Ethan." Her confidence boosted my spirits, temporarily displacing the anxiety that had been building. We talked for nearly an hour about interview strategies, potential questions, and what Oxford might be like if everything went well. After hanging up, I decided to organize my travel documents. My passport, which I'd obtained 2 years earlier for a field trip to Canada that ultimately fell through due to funding issues, was kept in my desk drawer along with my birth certificate and social security card. Except it wasn't there. At first, I assumed I'd misplaced it, perhaps moved it to a more secure location and forgotten. I methodically searched every drawer, shelf, and potential hiding place in my small bedroom. By midnight, with my room in disarray and still no passport in sight, the first tendrils of panic began to take hold. The next morning, after a restless night, I expanded my search to the common areas of the house, careful not to draw attention to my growing desperation. My departure was now just 2 days away, and without my passport, the non-refundable bus tickets would be useless. More importantly, missing the interview would mean losing my only shot at the scholarship. By evening, I could no longer hide my situation. At dinner, I cleared my throat during a lull in conversation. "Has anyone seen my passport? The blue booklet with my name on it." My mother barely looked up from her pot roast. "Why would any of us have your passport?" "I'm not saying anyone took it," I clarified, though the thought had increasingly crossed my mind. "Just wondering if someone saw it while cleaning or moved it by accident." My father shook his head. "You should keep better track of important documents, son." I noticed Kimberly studying her plate with unusual intensity. "Kim?" I asked directly. "Have you seen it?" She looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Why would I have anything to do with your passport?" Something in her tone, a slight defensive edge, confirmed my suspicions. After dinner, while everyone watched TV in the living room, I did something I'd never done before. I entered Kimberly's room without permission. Her room was meticulously organized, a stark contrast to the chaos I'd created in mine while searching. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for until I opened her jewelry box and found, tucked beneath a layer of necklaces, a small torn piece of blue cover material, unmistakably from a passport. Anger and disbelief coursed through me as I confronted Kimberly in the living room, holding the damning evidence. "You went through my things?" she shrieked, focusing on my transgression rather than her own. "Where is it?" I demanded, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "What did you do with my passport?" My parents, initially shocked by my accusation, began defending Kimberly before she'd even responded. "Ethan, how dare you accuse your sister?" my mother said. "You have no proof that piece of paper came from your passport," my father added. But Kimberly's face had flushed red, not with shame, but with a strange mix of defiance and vindication. "Fine," she finally said. "I took it. And you know what? I shredded it and burned the pieces." The room fell silent. Even Kevin looked up from his phone, suddenly interested in the family drama unfolding. "Why?" I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. Kimberly stood up, her voice rising with each word. "Because you always think you're better than us." "Oxford? Really? Why can't you be content with what you have here like the rest of us? Every time you achieve something, it makes everything we've accomplished look small and pathetic." I expected my parents to intervene, to express shock at what their daughter had done. Instead, my father sighed heavily and said words I'll never forget. Son, maybe this is a sign. Some opportunities aren't meant for everyone. There's nothing wrong with staying close to home, building a life here like your sister has. My mother nodded in agreement. Family should come first, Ethan. These fancy universities will just fill your head with ideas that'll take you further away from us. In that moment, I realized a devastating truth. They weren't just excusing Kimberly's behavior, they were glad she'd done it. My potential success threatened the family narrative they'd carefully constructed, one where ambition was limited to promotions at local businesses and happiness meant settling for what was comfortable and familiar. I retreated to my room, the weight of betrayal crushing my chest. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. All set for Thursday? Can't wait to see you, man. How could I tell him that my own family had sabotaged my future? That the sister I grew up with had destroyed my passport, and my parents had essentially endorsed her actions. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I felt the walls of my childhood home closing in around me. For the first time in my life, I considered giving up, accepting that perhaps my family was right, that dreams beyond Pinewood weren't meant for people like me. Then my phone rang. It was Amanda. Just checking in on final preparations, she said cheerfully. I can't stop telling everyone my boyfriend might be going to Oxford. The pride in her voice was like a lifeline in the darkness. As we talked, something stirred in my memory, a conversation from months ago that suddenly took on new significance. The morning after Kimberly's confession, an uncomfortable silence settled over breakfast. My parents avoided eye contact. Kimberly maintained an air of righteous indignation, and Kevin kept glancing between us, sensing the tension but wisely staying quiet. I need to ask one more time, I said, breaking the silence. Where exactly is my passport? My mother sighed dramatically. Ethan, we've been through this. Your sister made a mistake, but dwelling on it won't solve anything. A mistake? I echoed incredulously. She deliberately destroyed my legal documentation to prevent me from attending a life-changing interview. My father set down his coffee mug with enough force to slosh liquid onto the table. That's enough. What's done is done. Maybe if you were more careful with your belongings, this wouldn't have happened. The victim blaming was the final straw. So this is my fault now? Kimberly smirked. You probably would have lost it anyway. Remember how you misplaced your cap and gown before graduation? That particular incident flashed in my memory. I hadn't misplaced anything. My cap and gown had mysteriously appeared in the garden shed an hour before the ceremony, after I'd torn the house apart looking for them. I'd been too relieved to question it at the time, but now... Did you take those too? I asked, the pattern suddenly clear. Kimberly's expression flickered momentarily before she regained composure. Don't be ridiculous. But that brief look confirmed everything. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a lifelong campaign to undermine me. I need to know exactly what you did with my passport, I insisted. Did you really burn it, or is it hidden somewhere? I told you it's gone. Kimberly snapped. Why can't you just accept that maybe this fancy interview isn't meant to be? My mother reached across the table to pat my hand. Honey, there will be other opportunities. Ones that don't take you so far from home. The application deadline for the local community college is still open. My father added helpfully. They have some very practical degree programs. The casual way they dismissed my ambitions felt like a physical blow. What hurt most wasn't just Kimberly's sabotage, it was realizing my parents were complicit in it. They weren't just making the best of a bad situation, they were relieved that my path had been blocked. I stood up, unable to stomach another minute at that table. I need some air. Outside, I called Professor Wilson, explaining the situation in halting, embarrassed sentences. That's quite extraordinary, he said after a long pause. Family dynamics can be complex, but this goes beyond typical jealousy. I don't know what to do, I admitted. Without my passport, I can't make the interview. There was another pause before Professor Wilson spoke again. Ethan, do you remember our conversation about contingency planning? After the Model UN documentation incident last semester? The memory clicked into place. A folder of essential documents had mysteriously gone missing before our team's trip to the regional Model United Nations competition. Professor Wilson had pulled me aside afterward. In international relations, always expect complications, he'd advised. Important documents should always have backups. Following that conversation, I'd taken precautions that now seemed almost prophetic. I need to check something, I told Professor Wilson. I'll call you back. Returning to my room, I went straight to my bookshelf. Between worn copies of political theory texts sat The Art of Diplomacy, a book Professor Wilson had given me. Using a small key I kept hidden in my desk lamp base, I unlocked the hollowed-out interior where, 6 months earlier, I had stored a duplicate passport. After the Model UN incident, I'd applied for a replacement passport, claiming my original had been damaged by water. I'd kept this secret from my family, storing the new one in my dorm room and bringing home only the original during breaks. The backup had remained hidden in the book when I moved home after the semester ended. Holding the pristine blue passport in my hands, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. I'd created this contingency because on some level, I hadn't trusted my family, and that instinct had been correct. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Bus schedule shows you should be leaving tomorrow morning. Everything on track? I responded with newfound determination. Change of plans? Arriving late tomorrow night instead. Will explain when I see you. Next, I booked a seat on the last bus leaving for New York the following evening. It would arrive just hours before my interview, giving me minimal time to prepare and rest, but it was my only option. With quiet efficiency, I began packing essentials into my duffel bag, hiding it under my bed. I would leave without telling my family, not out of spite, but necessity. They had made their position clear. My success threatened their comfort. I couldn't risk further sabotage. That evening, Kimberly cornered me in the hallway. Still sulking? She asked, her tone falsely sweet. No, I replied honestly. I'm coming to terms with things. Something in my calm demeanor seemed to unsettle her. She'd expected continued anger or pleading, not acceptance. Well, good, she said uncertainly. It's about time you got realistic about your place in the world. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and felt a strange mix of pity and clarity. Kimberly, have you ever wondered why you feel so threatened by my opportunities? Her expression hardened. I'm not threatened by anything. I'm successful right here. I know, I said gently. And that's perfectly fine. But my success doesn't diminish yours. There's room for both of us to build the lives we want. Save the philosophical bullshit for your professors. She snapped, storming past me to her room. That night, as my family slept, I contemplated the dynamics that had shaped our relationships. My parents had always expected less from me academically than from Kimberly, yet paradoxically, my natural aptitude for learning had created a complex web of resentment. Every achievement became something to be minimized rather than celebrated. By morning, I had made peace with my decision. I would attend the interview, give it my absolute best, and regardless of the outcome, I would not return to this house permanently. Some bridges, once revealed as structurally unsound, cannot be safely recrossed. The next day passed in excruciating slowness. I pretended to research local job opportunities on my laptop, nodding along as my parents suggested various entry-level positions in town. All the while, my backup passport remained securely hidden in my jacket pocket, my packed bag still under the bed. At 5:30 p.m., I casually mentioned going to Amanda's house to watch a movie. My parents, relieved by my apparent acceptance of my circumstances, barely acknowledged my departure. Only Kevin offered a genuine "see you later" as I walked out the door with my duffel bag, supposedly containing overnight essentials for Amanda's. Instead, I texted Amanda from the bus station. Something came up with the scholarship. I'll explain everything when I get back. As the bus pulled away from Pinewood, carrying me toward New York and possibility, I felt no triumph, only a hollow ache where family support should have been, and a steely determination to create a future based on my own merit rather than others' limitations. The Greyhound bus rumbled through the night, its headlights cutting through darkness as we crossed state lines. Around me, passengers dozed in uncomfortable positions or stared blankly at phone screens. I couldn't sleep, partly due to the uncomfortable seat, but mostly because my mind kept replaying my family's betrayal. 3 months earlier, after the Model UN document incident, Professor Wilson had invited me to his office for what he called a lesson in practical diplomacy. "Reynolds," he'd said in his precise British accent, "let me tell you something they don't teach in textbooks. In international relations, documentation problems are often not accidental." He'd gone on to explain how during his UN career, he'd witnessed diplomatic passports mysteriously disappear before crucial votes, visa applications inexplicably delayed, and credentials suddenly questioned. Those who operate in global circles understand that controlling someone's ability to be physically present is a powerful form of influence. At the time, I'd found his stories fascinating but somewhat paranoid. Why would anyone deliberately create documentation problems? "Always have contingency plans for important documents," he'd advised. "Especially when the stakes are high." That conversation had prompted me to apply for the duplicate passport, a decision that now seemed almost prescient. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Dude, what happened? Thought you'd be here by now." I typed a brief explanation, promising details in person. His response came quickly. "Your sister did what? That's some next-level sabotage. Glad you had a backup. Bus arriving at Port Authority?" After confirming my arrival time, a brutal 3:15 a.m., I leaned my head against the window, watching America slide past in the darkness. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. My own sister had deliberately destroyed my passport to prevent me from pursuing an opportunity she perceived as threatening. More devastating still, my parents had supported her action, framing my ambition as somehow disloyal to family. Was this what family was supposed to be? A gravitational force that kept you orbiting within an acceptable radius, pulling you back harshly if you dared venture too far? The bus made a rest stop in eastern Pennsylvania. While other passengers lined up for coffee and vending machine snacks, I found a quiet corner and called Amanda. "I've been worried sick," she said immediately. "Your texts were so cryptic. Are you really on a bus to New York right now?" I told her everything. Kimberly's confession, my parents' reaction, the backup passport. "That's..." Amanda paused, searching for words. "That's genuinely disturbing, Ethan. I knew your relationship with your sister was strained, but this crosses every line. The worst part is knowing they're all probably relieved right now," I said. "They think they've successfully kept me in my place." "Their loss," Amanda said firmly. "Go ace that interview. Show them what they tried to prevent." Her unwavering support contrasted sharply with my family's behavior, highlighting the difference between relationships that lift you up and those that hold you back. Back on the bus, I reviewed my interview preparation notes, trying to focus on the opportunity ahead rather than the betrayal behind me. The scholarship committee would be evaluating not just my academic achievements but my character, resilience, and potential as a global leader. Ironically, the past 24 hours had tested those qualities more rigorously than any interview could. We arrived at Port Authority bus terminal at 3:28 a.m., 13 minutes behind schedule. Despite the late hour, Marcus was waiting, his familiar tall figure easy to spot even in my exhausted state. "You look like hell," he said by way of greeting, pulling me into a quick hug. "Feel worse," I admitted as we navigated toward the subway. Marcus's apartment was exactly as he described, tiny, in a fifth-floor walk-up, with a pull-out couch that had definitely seen better days. But after nearly 20 hours on a bus, it looked like luxury accommodations. "Interview's at 10 a.m., right?" Marcus asked, setting his alarm. "That gives you about 5 hours to sleep. I'll wake you with coffee and whatever breakfast I can scrounge up." Too exhausted for conversation, I managed a grateful nod before collapsing onto the couch. Despite my fatigue, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by anxiety dreams where I arrived at the interview only to find my family sitting on the selection committee. True to his word, Marcus woke me precisely at 8:30 a.m. with coffee and a bodega egg sandwich. While I showered, he pressed my interview suit with an iron that looked like it hadn't been used since he'd moved in. "So walk me through exactly what happened," he said as I dressed. "Your sister actually destroyed your passport?" I recounted the entire story, finding it both painful and cathartic to share. "That's seriously messed up," Marcus said when I finished. "And your parents were okay with this?" "Not just okay, they supported her. My dad actually said some opportunities aren't meant for everyone, like I should know my place." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "Families are supposed to lift each other up, not clip each other's wings." "Apparently mine missed that memo," I said, adjusting my tie in the small bathroom mirror. The lack of sleep showed in the dark circles under my eyes, but there was nothing to be done about it now. "Ready for this?" Marcus asked as I gathered my portfolio containing copies of my transcripts, recommendations, and research proposals. "As I'll ever be," I replied, patting my jacket pocket to confirm my backup passport was still there, a now instinctive gesture after recent events. Outside, New York bustled with morning energy, oblivious to my personal drama. As we navigated crowded sidewalks toward the subway station, I felt a strange sense of anonymity and possibility. Here, no one knew me as Ethan Reynolds from Pinewood, the odd one out who read too much and dreamed too big. Here, ambition wasn't something to be contained but the very currency of daily life. The interview was being held at the Oxford American Foundation offices near Columbus Circle, a sleek, modern building that exuded prestige. In the lobby, Marcus gave me a final encouraging nod before heading to his office job downtown. "Text me the second it's over," he said. "Regardless of what happens, we're celebrating tonight. You made it here despite everything, that's already a win." As I rode the elevator to the 14th floor, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Not just the bus ride or even the years of academic preparation, but the lifelong experience of swimming against the current of expectations. Perhaps, in some twisted way, my family had prepared me for this opportunity better than unconditional support ever could have. They had inadvertently taught me persistence, self-reliance, and the courage to stand alone, qualities any global leader would need. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area where 3 other candidates already waited, each projecting carefully controlled confidence. As I signed in with the receptionist, I silently thanked Professor Wilson for his prescient advice about contingency planning, and my own younger self for having the foresight to follow it. Whatever happened in the next hour would change the trajectory of my life. But I had already crossed the most difficult threshold, choosing my own path despite those who wanted to restrict it. In that sense, I had already succeeded. The Oxford American Foundation's reception area epitomized understated elegance, walnut paneling, leather chairs, and discreet lighting that illuminated framed photographs of ancient Oxford colleges. The 3 other candidates glanced up briefly as I entered, then returned to their preparation materials with studied nonchalance. I recognized the competitive atmosphere immediately. It reminded me of Model UN conferences where everyone pretended to be casually brilliant. Taking a seat, I surreptitiously assessed my competition, a young woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit reviewing color-coded notes, a man about my age with tortoiseshell glasses reading The Economist, and another woman who appeared completely relaxed, as though scholarship interviews were a regular Thursday activity for her. "Ethan Reynolds?" The receptionist's voice broke through my observations. "They're ready for you now." My heart lurched. I had assumed I'd be last, given my late application edition. Being called first meant no time to gather further impressions or calm my nerves. I was led down a hallway to a conference room where 5 people sat at a crescent-shaped table. At the center was a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, Dr. James Thompson, according to the nameplate before him. On either side sat 2 women and another man, all with the poised confidence that comes from decades in academia and international affairs. "Mr. Reynolds," Dr. Thompson said, gesturing to the single chair facing them. "Thank you for joining us today." His choice of words, as though I'd casually accepted a dinner invitation rather than overcome significant obstacles to be present, struck me as ironically appropriate. "The pleasure is mine," I replied, taking my seat and placing my portfolio on the table before me. Dr. Thompson introduced the panel: Dr. Eliza Montgomery and Dr. Claire Bennett from Oxford's International Relations Department, Ambassador Richard Davis from the UN Development Programme, and Dr. Samuel Harrington, an American Rhodes Scholar who now lectured at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. "We've reviewed your application materials thoroughly," Dr. Thompson began. "Quite impressive academic achievements, particularly considering your background. However, we're curious about the late addition of your candidacy. Professor Wilson speaks very highly of you, but the timing is unusual." I could have offered a sanitized explanation, but something told me authenticity mattered more than polished evasion. "My candidacy timing reflects exactly why this opportunity means so much to me," I began. "I come from a context where academic ambition beyond local expectations is often viewed with suspicion rather than support. Professor Wilson recognized potential I was taught not to value in myself." Dr. Montgomery leaned forward slightly. "Could you elaborate on these contextual challenges?" Taking a measured breath, I shared a carefully calibrated version of my reality. Growing up in a family and community where intellectual pursuits were considered impractical distractions, where success was defined by settling down locally rather than expanding horizons. I didn't mention Kimberly or the passport incident specifically, but I did touch on experiencing active discouragement rather than support. "And yet here you are," Ambassador Davis observed. "What does that tell us about you?" "That I understand the difference between obstacles and impossibilities," I replied. "And that I've learned to create contingency plans when facing the former." A subtle expression of approval crossed several faces. What followed was the most intellectually rigorous 90 minutes of my life. The questions ranged from my analysis of specific geopolitical situations to ethical dilemmas in international governance. They probed my understanding of diplomatic history, theoretical frameworks, and practical applications. When Dr. Harrington asked about my research proposal concerning economic development models in post-conflict regions, I drew on both academic knowledge and personal experience. "Systems of mutual dependence create stability," I explained. "I've observed that when people's success depends on others' well-being, cooperation becomes self-interest. The challenge is creating those interdependencies authentically rather than imposing them artificially." "Interesting perspective," Dr. Harrington noted. "And how might your background inform this research direction?" The question invited personal disclosure without demanding it, a subtle diplomatic skill I recognized and appreciated. "I've experienced firsthand how economic limitations can create zero-sum thinking," I said carefully. "When resources or opportunities seem scarce, people sometimes perceive others' advancement as threatening rather than inspirational. My research explores how to transform that mindset at community and regional levels." Dr. Bennett, who had been mostly observing until now, spoke up. "Oxford can be a challenging environment for students from non-traditional backgrounds. How would you navigate that transition?" It was a question that touched on class, cultural capital, and adaptation, all things I'd considered extensively. "With the same approach I've always taken to unfamiliar territory," I answered. "Observe carefully, learn continuously, contribute authentically, and remember that discomfort is the price of growth. I don't expect Oxford to adapt to me, but I also won't pretend to be someone I'm not to fit in." The honesty seemed to resonate, particularly with Dr. Harrington, who nodded almost imperceptibly. As the interview approached its conclusion, Dr. Thompson posed a final question. "The Oxford Global Leaders Scholarship isn't just about academic excellence, Mr. Reynolds. It's about identifying individuals who will leverage this opportunity to create meaningful impact. Why should that person be you?" The question cut to the heart of everything: my journey, my motivations, my potential future contributions. For a moment, the faces of my family flashed in my mind, not their disapproval, but what it represented, the limitation of potential based on fear and narrow definitions of success. Because I understand that the greatest barrier to progress isn't lack of resources but lack of imagination, I said. People cannot aspire to what they cannot envision. My experience has taught me that expanding possibilities for one person creates ripples that can transform communities. I want to be part of creating those ripples at a global scale. Dr. Thompson studied me for a long moment before nodding. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. We'll be making our decision by this evening. The Foundation will contact successful candidates by phone, followed by formal email confirmation. I thanked them for their consideration and left the conference room with legs that felt simultaneously leaden and weightless. In the elevator, I finally released the breath I'd been half-holding throughout the interview. Outside, the mid-morning sunlight felt surreal after the intensity of the conference room. I texted Marcus. Interview done. No idea how it went. Brain feels liquefied. His response came quickly. Meet at Central Park. Bench near Columbus Circle entrance. We'll bring coffee and sugar for brain reformation. 20 minutes later, I collapsed onto the park bench beside him, accepting the offered coffee with pathetic gratitude. So? Marcus prompted. Details? I recounted the interview questions and my responses, analyzing and second-guessing each interaction. Sounds like you crushed it, Marcus said when I finished. Especially given the circumstances. Most people would have cracked under the pressure. Or never made it to the interview at all, I added, thinking of my backup passport. We spent the next few hours wandering the park, Marcus deliberately keeping conversation light to distract me from obsessively checking my phone. By late afternoon, we'd returned to his apartment where I alternated between refreshing my email and staring at my silent phone. They said evening? Marcus reminded me. It's barely 4 o'clock. At 6:17 p.m., my phone rang with an unknown number. With trembling fingers, I answered and heard Dr. Thompson's distinctive voice. Mr. Reynolds? James Thompson here. I'm pleased to inform you that the committee has selected you as one of this year's Oxford Global Leaders Scholarship recipients. The words seemed to come from a great distance, barely penetrating the sudden rushing in my ears. Are you still there, Mr. Reynolds? Yes, I managed. Yes, I'm here. Thank you. I'm honored doesn't begin to cover it. Excellence deserves recognition, Dr. Thompson said simply. You'll receive formal documentation shortly, including next steps regarding visa applications and orientation details. Congratulations. After ending the call, I sat in stunned silence until Marcus waved his hand in front of my face. Well? He demanded. Don't leave me hanging, man. I got it, I said, the reality slowly dawning. I actually got it. Marcus's whoop of celebration probably disturbed his neighbors, but neither of us cared. As promised, we spent the evening celebrating, first at a local pizza place where I devoured 2 slices with the ferocity of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days, then at a bar where Marcus insisted on buying congratulatory drinks for both of us. Through the celebration, a bittersweet understanding settled over me. This achievement, possibly the most significant of my life, had no family waiting to share in my joy. The people who should have been my biggest supporters had actively tried to prevent this moment. Yet alongside that sadness was a profound realization: family is not just the one you're born into, but also the one you create. Professor Wilson, who had seen potential worth nurturing. Marcus, who had offered unconditional support and his couch without hesitation. Amanda, who had believed in my abilities when I doubted myself. Tomorrow, I would return to Pinewood to face my family with news that would either bridge the gulf between us or widen it permanently. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply exist in this moment of vindication and possibility, a moment that almost didn't happen, but for a backup plan and the determination to use it. The bus ride back to Pinewood carried none of the desperate urgency of my journey to New York. Instead, a strange calm had settled over me, the quietude that comes with absolute certainty about one's path forward. I'd spent the morning with Marcus, using his printer to make copies of the official scholarship offer that had arrived in my email overnight. The Oxford Global Leaders Scholarship would cover full tuition, accommodation, and a generous stipend for 2 years while I completed my master's in international relations. The formal letter on Oxford University letterhead felt like a passport itself, not just to a prestigious education, but to a future I had designed rather than inherited. "What's your game plan?" Marcus had asked as we waited for my bus. "Triumphant return? Righteous fury? Silent treatment?" "Honesty," I'd replied. "Just straightforward honesty." The bus arrived in Pinewood at 7:36 p.m., pulling into the small station where nothing ever seemed to change. Main Street looked exactly as it had 2 days earlier, yet everything had shifted fundamentally in ways invisible to the casual observer. I walked the familiar route home, my duffel bag over one shoulder, scholarship letter tucked securely in my inner jacket pocket. The evening air carried the scent of Mrs. Hendrick's lilacs from 2 doors down, a reminder that some constants remain even as life transforms around them. When I pushed open our front door, I found my family in their usual positions for a Friday evening, my father in his recliner watching a baseball game, my mother sorting coupons at the dining table, Kevin texting on the couch, and Kimberly flipping through a magazine. The normality of the scene was jarring after the intensity of the past 48 hours. My mother noticed me first. "Ethan! Where have you been? We thought you were at Amanda's." The genuine confusion in her voice confirmed my suspicion. They had no idea what I'd done. In their worldview, my path had been successfully blocked, my ambitions contained. There had been no need to even wonder where I might be. "I wasn't at Amanda's," I said, setting down my bag. "I was in New York." The statement landed like a stone dropped in still water. My father muted the television. Kimberly's head snapped up from her magazine. Even Kevin set down his phone. "New York?" my father repeated. "What are you talking about?" "I attended my scholarship interview. The one Kimberly tried to prevent by destroying my passport." Kimberly's face flushed crimson. "That's impossible. Your passport was destroyed." "Yes. But I had a backup." I removed my passport from my pocket and held it up. "I applied for a duplicate months ago, after the Model UN incident. Kept it hidden because on some level, I think I always suspected something like this might happen." My mother stood up, her expression wavering between disbelief and emerging concern. "You went to New York without telling us? Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" Her focus on the risk rather than the reason spoke volumes. "I made a calculated decision," I replied evenly. "The danger of missing this opportunity far outweighed any risks of travel." "So you just, what? Snuck out? Lied to us?" my father demanded, his voice rising. "I told you I was going to Amanda's. You didn't ask questions because you thought the problem was solved. The passport was destroyed, the threat of my success was neutralized." Kimberly stood up abruptly. "You're twisting everything. We were trying to protect you." "Protect me? From what, exactly?" "A full scholarship to one of the world's best universities. International career opportunities? A future I've worked years to build? From disappointment," she shot back. "From rejection. From thinking you're too good for your family." The raw honesty of her response caught me off guard. In her warped perspective, she truly believed she'd been acting in my interests rather than against them. "Kim," I said more gently, "wanting different things doesn't make someone think they're too good for where they came from. It just means they're different." My father stood up now, his expression hardening. "So did you go all the way to New York just to spite your sister? To prove some point?" I reached into my jacket and removed the scholarship letter, placing it on the coffee table. "I went to New York because I earned an opportunity. And this is the result." My mother picked up the letter, her eyes widening as she scanned its contents. "Oxford, full scholarship. September start date. You actually got it?" Kimberly's voice was barely audible. I did. No triumph in my tone, just simple acknowledgement of fact. My father took the letter from my mother, reading it with increasing comprehension. I could see the moment reality truly registered. His son would indeed be leaving, not just Pinewood but the country. Well, he said finally, his tone shifting to something artificially hearty. This is quite an achievement. We always knew you were smart. The sudden pivot to pride was almost more painful than the earlier dismissal. Now that success was confirmed, they wanted to retroactively claim supportive roles they had never played. No, I said quietly but firmly. You don't get to do that. You don't get to undermine me, actively sabotage my opportunities, tell me to know my place, and then pretend you were supportive all along when it turns out I succeeded despite you. Now wait just a minute. My father began, his face reddening. We've supported you your entire life. Put food on the table, clothes on your back. That's parenting, I interrupted. Basic provision isn't the same as support. Support would have been encouraging my academic interests instead of treating them as peculiarities to be tolerated. Support would have been celebrating scholarships instead of minimizing them. Support would have been condemning Kimberly's actions instead of justifying them. My mother began to cry, quiet, manipulative tears that had often ended family confrontations in the past. How can you say such hurtful things? We've always wanted what's best for you. What you've wanted, I clarified, is what's most comfortable for you. My success made you uncomfortable because it challenged your narratives about what's possible and appropriate for people from Pinewood. Kevin, who had been watching this exchange with uncharacteristic attentiveness, finally spoke. So you're really going to England? The simple question cut through the tension. Yes. Term starts in September. That's actually pretty cool, he said, earning a glare from Kimberly. I began gathering the few possessions I would need immediately, my laptop, important documents, some clothes. The rest could wait until I found more permanent arrangements. What are you doing? My mother asked, alarm replacing tears. Packing essential items. I'll be staying with Amanda until I figure out summer housing. You're leaving? Just like that? My father's indignation seemed genuine, as though the natural consequence of their actions had never occurred to him. I think that's best for everyone, I replied. I need to prepare for Oxford, and clearly my presence here creates complications. Kimberly, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly erupted. So this is it? You get your fancy scholarship and now you're too good for us? Just abandoning your family? I paused my packing to look directly at her. You destroyed my passport to prevent me from attending an interview. Dad said some opportunities aren't meant for everyone. Mom suggested it was a sign I should stay close to home. You all made your positions very clear. I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm respecting the boundaries you established. The stark recitation of their actions hung in the air, impossible to deny yet clearly uncomfortable to confront. My father made one last attempt at salvaging his authority. Son, I think you're overreacting. Families have disagreements. Kimberly made a mistake, but it wasn't a mistake, I interrupted. It was a deliberate action that all of you endorsed. Actions have consequences. This is simply the natural result of choices you all made. As I zipped my duffel bag, my mother made a final emotional appeal. Please don't leave like this. We're your family. The statement gave me pause. They were indeed my family, the people who should have been my strongest advocates but had instead become obstacles to overcome. The realization brought sadness rather than anger. You're right. You are my family. That won't change. But right now, I need distance to process everything that's happened and prepare for what's ahead. When I'm ready, we can talk about rebuilding trust. I gathered my bags and headed for the door, pausing briefly to address Kevin. I'm still your brother. That doesn't change because of Oxford or distance. Call me anytime. He nodded, something like understanding passing between us. As I stepped outside into the evening air, I felt no triumph or vindication, only the quiet certainty that comes with choosing authenticity over appeasement. The path ahead would be challenging in different ways than the one behind me had been, but it would be one of my own making. Amanda was waiting in her car at the end of the block, as we'd arranged by text during the bus ride. Her smile as I approached contained all the genuine pride and support my family's reaction had lacked. "Ready?" she asked as I loaded my bags into her back seat. "More than you know," I replied, closing the door on Pinewood and opening one to whatever came next. 6 months later, I stood on the ancient cobblestones of Oxford's Radcliffe Square, autumn leaves swirling around my feet as students hurried past in billowing black robes. The golden stone buildings glowed in late afternoon sunlight, their centuries of history both intimidating and inspiring to someone who, until recently, had never traveled beyond neighboring states. My first term at Oxford had been a whirlwind of adjustments, academic, cultural, and personal. The intensity of the coursework made my undergraduate studies seem like casual reading, while the international student body had expanded my perspective in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I'd formed friendships with future diplomats from Singapore, economists from Brazil, and policy analysts from Kenya, connections that spanned continents and worldviews. My studio apartment in graduate housing was modest but comfortable, decorated with a few carefully chosen items that represented my journey. A framed acceptance letter, a map marked with places I'd visited since arriving, and a small photograph of Amanda during her visit the previous month. Our relationship had weathered the transition to long distance with surprising resilience. Technology helped bridge the physical gap, but it was our shared understanding of what this opportunity meant that truly sustained us. "I didn't fall for small-town Ethan or Oxford Ethan," she'd said during her visit. "I fell for the person underneath all those contexts." My phone buzzed with an incoming email notification, Professor Wilson checking in as he did every few weeks. His mentorship had continued across the Atlantic, our conversations evolving from teacher-student dynamics to something approaching collegial respect. "Remember," he told me before I left, "the scholarship got you through Oxford's gates, but what you do inside them is entirely your own achievement." As for my family, our communication had been minimal and carefully managed. I'd sent a brief email after arriving, assuring them I was safely settled. My mother had responded with surface-level pleasantries and a few local news updates. My father hadn't written separately. Kevin occasionally sent text messages about his baseball games or random questions about England. From Kimberly, there had been complete silence. Until last week. Her email had appeared unexpectedly in my inbox with the subject line, "Overdue apology." I'd stared at it for nearly an hour before finding the courage to open it. "Ethan," she'd written, "I've started and deleted this email about 20 times over the past months. Nothing I write seems adequate for what I did. Sorry doesn't begin to cover deliberately sabotaging something so important to you. There's no excuse, but maybe some context will help you understand, even if you can't forgive. I've spent my entire life being praised for meeting minimum expectations, graduating high school, getting an office job, staying in Pinewood. You were always reaching for more, and instead of being inspired by that, I resented it because it highlighted my own lack of ambition. When you got the interview invitation, it forced me to confront the smallness of the life I'd chosen. Destroying your passport was never about you. It was about protecting myself from that realization. I've started taking night classes at the community college. Nothing prestigious, just business administration, but it's something I chose for myself rather than accepted by default. I don't expect this changes anything between us, but I wanted you to know I'm trying to learn from my mistakes. Kim. I hadn't responded yet, still processing the unexpected vulnerability from someone who had always maintained a facade of smug superiority. The apology seemed genuine, but trust, once broken, required more than words to rebuild. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Marcus. "Special delivery arriving tomorrow. Check Oxford mailroom PM." The cryptic message made sense the following afternoon when I collected a package containing American snacks I'd mentioned missing, along with a note. "Fuel for changing the world. Don't forget us little people when you're running the UN, Marcus." That evening, I had an unexpected visitor. Professor Wilson had come to Oxford for an academic conference and suggested meeting for dinner at the Eagle and Child, the historic pub where J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis had once gathered with their literary group. "So, Reynolds," he said after we'd ordered, his familiar formal address comforting in its consistency. "How are you finding Oxford?" "Challenging," I admitted. "In the best possible way." "And the personal adjustment? Being so far from home?" The question carried layers of meaning beyond geographic distance. "I'm learning that home is more complex than a physical location," I replied. "Sometimes it's where you're from, sometimes it's where you're going, and sometimes it's the people who support your journey between those points." He nodded approvingly. "Well articulated. And your family? Any developments?" I told him about Kimberly's email, my mixed feelings about her apparent growth, and my uncertainty about how to proceed. "Forgiveness and reconciliation are distinct processes," he observed. "The former is internal, requiring only your decision. The latter is relational, requiring mutual effort and demonstrated change." "So you think I should respond?" "I think," he said carefully, "that acknowledging someone's steps toward growth doesn't obligate you to vulnerable proximity. Boundaries can be both compassionate and protective." His insight, as always, cut through my confusion to the heart of the matter. I could acknowledge Kimberly's apparent growth without immediately resuming a close relationship that had proven harmful. That night, I crafted a measured response. "Kim, thank you for your apology. I appreciate the courage it took to send it and the self-reflection it represents. I'm glad to hear you're pursuing education that matters to you. I need more time and evidence of change before considering a closer relationship, but I wish you well on your path forward. Ethan." As autumn deepened toward winter, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, not just the dramatic confrontation and escape, but the years of quiet persistence that had preceded it. Each small choice to pursue knowledge despite discouragement, each time I'd chosen ambition over acceptance, had been a step toward this outcome. The greatest lesson hadn't been academic at all, but deeply personal. That family, both given and chosen, shapes us profoundly, but doesn't define us permanently. That sometimes the people who should support us become obstacles to overcome. That boundaries aren't selfish but necessary for growth. And perhaps most importantly, that backup plans aren't pessimistic but pragmatic. I couldn't know what the future held, whether Kimberly's apology represented genuine transformation or temporary remorse, whether my parents would eventually recognize the harm in their attitudes, whether Kevin might forge his own path beyond Pinewood's limitations. Those outcomes weren't mine to control. What I did know was that my journey hadn't ended with winning the scholarship or arriving at Oxford. Those were merely waypoints on a continuing path of self-definition and purpose-finding. The backup passport that had made this possible wasn't just a document, but a metaphor for the importance of creating alternatives when primary routes are blocked. Sometimes the most important journey isn't across oceans but across perspectives, from seeing yourself through others' limiting lenses to recognizing your own capacity for resilience and growth. From accepting the boundaries others place around your potential to drawing your own, wider circles of possibility. As I walked back to my apartment through Oxford's medieval streets, a light snow beginning to fall, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the opportunity itself, but for every obstacle that had taught me to find alternate routes forward. Sometimes the paths we forge through resistance lead to exactly where we're meant to be. Have you ever had to create a backup plan when someone tried to block your dreams? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life experiences. Remember, sometimes the family you choose becomes more important than the family you're born into. Thank you for listening, and may you always have the courage to pursue your dreams, no matter who tries to stand in your way.